In 1965, Falstaff Beer was the third largest selling beer in the United States. Not third in Missouri, not third in the South, third in the entire country, behind only Budweiser and Schlitz. 7.5 million barrels shipped in a single year. 16 breweries operating simultaneously from California to Rhode Island. The Falstaff name appeared on scoreboards, on delivery trucks, on the back pages of every major newspaper from St. Louis to New Orleans. In the working-class neighborhoods of Missouri, Nebraska, Louisiana, and Texas, it was not a preference. It was simply what beer was. 13 years later, in 1978, Falstaff Beer filed for bankruptcy, not because a stronger competitor outspent them, not because the American public stopped drinking beer, consumption was rising, not because the product failed in the market. Falstaff collapsed during one of the longest sustained periods of beer consumption growth in American history. It collapsed while people were still buying it. It collapsed because of decisions made at the exact moment everything appeared to be working perfectly. 1 in every 14 beers sold in America in 1965 carried the Falstaff name. By 1978, the company that brewed it no longer existed. But the real story of Falstaff Beer is not the bankruptcy filing, and it is not the market share numbers. It is the story of a German immigrant family that built something extraordinary from the wreckage of Prohibition, and of the generation that inherited that extraordinary thing and did not know what they actually had. Every week on this channel, we tell the stories behind the brands and the companies that shaped American life. Give the video a like and subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story begins in St. Louis, Missouri in 1917. St. Louis in 1917 was not a quiet city. It was the fourth largest city in the United States, a place where the smell of malt and hops competed with the smoke from steel foundries and river freight yards. The Mississippi ran along its eastern edge like a working artery, barges moving coal, grain, and timber in both directions, 24 hours a day, and underneath all of it, in the limestone cellars that honeycombed the bluffs above the river, dozens of German immigrant families were doing what they had done since arriving in America decades earlier. They were brewing beer. The Griesedick family was one of them. Heinrich Adam Griesedick was born in Stromberg, Germany in 1851 into a family that understood fermentation the way a carpenter understands wood, not as a science, but as a way of life passed from one generation to the next. He arrived in the United States in the 1870s, part of the great wave of German immigration that transformed the American Midwest. He settled in St. Louis not by accident but by design. The city already had the infrastructure, the climate, the limestone cellars, and above all the community, tens of thousands of German-speaking immigrants who understood what good beer tasted like and would not accept less. Heinrich did not arrive as an entrepreneur. He arrived as a craftsman. He worked first as a brewer's assistant, learning the American market from the ground up, which hops were available locally, which distributors could be trusted, which tavern owners paid on time. By the 1890s, he had enough knowledge and enough saved capital to open his own operation. The Griesedick Brothers Brewery took its first commercial orders in St. Louis in 1911. The address 1920 Shenandoah Avenue, on the south side of the city, in a neighborhood where nearly every family within 6 blocks had come from somewhere in Central Europe. The early years were not comfortable. The American brewing industry in the early 20th century was not a frontier. It was an established, fiercely competitive market dominated by names like Anheuser-Busch, Pabst, and Schlitz. These were not small operations. Anheuser-Busch alone was shipping more than 1 million barrels a year by 1901. For a family brewery on Shenandoah Avenue with a few delivery wagons and a handful of workers, carving out a sustainable share of that market required something more than a good recipe. It required patience, precision, and geographic focus. The Griesedecks focused on the neighborhoods the big breweries considered too small to bother with. The Union Halls in South St. Louis, the corner taverns in working-class wards where men came in after a 10-hour shift and ordered by habit, not by preference. In those rooms, consistency mattered more than reputation. If the beer was cold, clean, and the same every time, a man would order it again. That was the business model, and for nearly a decade, it worked. Then came 1920. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution took effect on January 17th of that year, and with it, the legal production and sale of alcohol in America ceased. Overnight, An industry that had employed hundreds of thousands of workers and generated hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenue simply stopped. More than 1,300 breweries were operating in the United States in 1919. The majority of them never reopened. The Griesediek family did not leave St. Louis. They did not sell the building. They converted the brewery to produce near beer, a malt beverage with the alcohol removed, along with carbonated soft drinks, malt syrup, and ice. It was not profitable in the way brewing had been, but it kept the equipment running, kept the staff employed, and kept the family's name on the building at 1920 Shenandoah Avenue. The loan that sustained them through those 13 years, approximately $40,000 borrowed against the property and equipment, was a debt they carried carefully and paid down slowly. Joseph Papa Joe Griesediek, Heinrich's son, watched all of it. He watched the industry collapse. He watched the competitors disappear. He watched the buildings go dark, the equipment get auctioned, the recipes get lost. And when the 21st Amendment repealed Prohibition on December 5, 1933, Papa Joe did not hesitate. He looked at the American beer market in the winter of 1933 and saw something most people missed entirely. The competition was gone. More than 1,000 breweries that had existed before Prohibition would never return. The men who had run them were too old, too broke, or too defeated to start over. The knowledge of how to run a large-scale brewing operation had partially evaporated from the American workforce. The demand, on the other hand, had not gone anywhere. 13 years of Prohibition had not eliminated the American appetite for beer. It had simply compressed it. Papa Joe needed a name. The Griesediek brothers brand was functional but modest. He wanted something with presence, something that suggested heritage, character, a certain robust pleasure in living. He found it in an unexpected place. Falstaff, the great comic knight of Shakespeare's Henry plays, a man defined by appetite, wit, and an unapologetic love of tavern life, was the name attached to a dormant St. Louis brewery whose assets had been liquidated years earlier. Papa Joe acquired the rights to the Falstaff name and trademark in 1933 for a figure that, by later accounts, was modest enough to be embarrassing in retrospect. He moved production into the Shenandoah Avenue facility, hired back the workers he could find, and brewed his first commercial batch of Falstaff beer before the end of the year. First-year production, approximately 75,000 barrels. It was a fraction of what Anheuser-Busch was producing, but it was a beginning, and Papa Joe understood something essential about beginnings. He was not trying to beat Budweiser. Not yet. He was trying to own the territory Budweiser had not bothered to claim. What Papa Joe brewed in that first year was not an accident of taste. It was a calculation. Falstaff was built on the German lager tradition. Bottom fermented, cold conditioned, aged longer than most American competitors were willing to wait. The process was slower and more expensive than the shortcuts some post-war breweries were already beginning to take. But the result was a beer with a specific character that drinkers in the Midwest and South recognized immediately. Cleaner than the heavy ales that had dominated pre-Prohibition taverns, lighter in body than the dense German imports that cost twice as much, with a finish that was dry without being bitter and cold without being thin. A working man could drink 3 of them on a Friday evening and still know his own name. That was not an accident. That was the product specification. The ingredients mattered too. Falstaff used a combination of domestic 2-row barley malt and a modest proportion of corn adjunct, a practice common in American brewing that reduced cost and lightened the flavor profile without, in Falstaff's case, sacrificing the clean lager character that distinguished it from cheaper competitors. Adjunct brewing, replacing a portion of malted barley with corn or rice to reduce production cost and produce a lighter body, was standard practice across the industry. What separated Falstaff was proportion and process. Papa Joe's brewmasters kept the adjunct ratio low enough that the malt character survived. The beer tasted like it was made by people who cared whether it tasted good. In 1934, that was a meaningful distinction. The packaging decision came next, and it reflected the same practical intelligence. In the mid-1930s, the steel can was still a novelty in the American beer market. The flat-top can had been introduced commercially in 1935, and most regional breweries were watching cautiously to see whether consumers would accept it. Papa Joe did not watch cautiously. Falstaff moved into can distribution earlier than most of its regional competitors, recognizing that the can solved a problem the bottle never fully had: portability, shelf stability, and the ability to be chilled quickly in a bucket of ice on a construction site or a riverboat deck. The Falstaff can carried the brand's distinctive red and white design, with the name rendered in a bold, slightly ornate typeface that suggested European heritage without being foreign. It looked serious. It looked like something that had been around longer than it had. At launch, Falstaff priced its standard can and bottle at 11 cents, 1 cent below Pabst Blue Ribbon, 2 cents below Budweiser. At a time when a St. Louis factory worker earned approximately $1.20 an hour, 11 cents meant a man could buy a cold beer after work without making a financial decision about it. The price point was not charity, it was strategy. Falstaff was buying loyalty at a discount, banking on the calculation that a drinker acquired young and treated fairly would stay for decades. In most cases, that calculation proved correct. The go-to-market approach was where Papa Joe's instincts were sharpest. He did not attempt to compete in markets where Anheuser-Busch and Pabst already had deep roots. He went to the places they had not bothered with. The mid-sized industrial cities along the Mississippi River corridor, the Gulf Coast port towns, the railroad junction cities of the Central Plains where men worked physical jobs and spent Friday evenings in establishments that were not yet called bars because the words sounded too refined for what they were. Papa Joe sent salesmen into those towns ahead of the delivery trucks. The salesmen did not carry brochures. They carried sample cases and personal introductions, and they sat across from tavern owners and listened to what those owners actually needed. Reliable delivery, consistent quality, a distributor who would answer the phone. By the late 1930s, Falstaff had established company-owned distribution routes connecting St. Louis to Kansas City, to Memphis, to New Orleans. The refrigerated trucks that ran those routes were not merely delivery vehicles. They were the physical expression of a promise that the beer arriving today would taste the same as the beer that had arrived last month. In an industry where quality control across long distances was genuinely difficult, that consistency was a competitive advantage that no advertising campaign could replicate. Falstaff signed its first regional radio sponsorships in Missouri and Illinois in 1936, attaching the brand name to baseball broadcasts at a moment when radio was the dominant medium of American working-class entertainment. The association between Falstaff and baseball was not accidental and would not be brief. By 1940, Falstaff held the tap lines in union halls, corner taverns, and railroad dining cars from St. Louis to the Gulf of Mexico. No competitor in that territory could match the freshness of the delivery, the consistency of the product, or the density of the personal relationships Papa Joe's salesmen had built over 6 years of showing up on time and keeping their word. The foundation was in place. What came next was not growth, it was dominance. The 1940s changed everything for Falstaff, and for America. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the American brewing industry faced a set of constraints it had never encountered before. Grain was rationed, steel for cans was diverted to military production, gasoline for delivery trucks was allocated by government permit, and the men who ran the breweries, drove the trucks, and worked the production lines were being drafted into the armed forces at a rate that left personnel rosters half empty within 18 months. Falstaff adapted without complaint because adaptation was what the company had always done best. Papa Joe converted a portion of the St. Louis production capacity to supply beer directly to the United States military. Falstaff cans, specially marked, stripped of unnecessary packaging to reduce weight, were shipped to supply depots serving American forces in the Pacific Theater. The volume was not enormous by military logistics standards, but the symbolism was not lost on the men who received them. A cold Falstaff in a canvas tent somewhere in the South Pacific was not merely a beverage. It was a 45-minute furlough from the war. It was St. Louis in a can. It was home compressed into 11 ounces of aluminum and malt. On the production lines back in Missouri, the workforce shifted. Women entered the brewery in significant numbers for the first time, operating filling equipment, managing quality checks, driving local delivery routes. The adjustment was not seamless, but it worked. Falstaff did not miss a single major distribution commitment during the war years. That reliability, maintained under conditions that broke the supply chains of less disciplined competitors, deepened the loyalty of every tavern owner and grocery buyer who depended on Falstaff showing up when it said it would. When the veterans came home in 1945 and 1946, they came home to a country that was ready to spend money, start families, and drink beer. A great many of them came home to Falstaff specifically, because it was what they had drunk before they left, and because in the specific calculus of post-war nostalgia, the familiar tasted better than anything new. Falstaff's sales increased 31% between 1945 and 1948. 3 new distribution territories were opened. A second production facility came online in Omaha, Nebraska in 1948, the first major geographic expansion beyond St. Louis. Papa Joe watched the numbers climb and made a decision that would define the next decade. He hired an advertising agency and told them a single thing: find the voice of this brand and make it sound like it has always been there. They found it in a man named Dizzy Dean. J. Hannah Dizzy Dean was one of the most celebrated baseball players in St. Louis Cardinals history. A right-handed pitcher who had won 30 games in the 1934 season, led the Cardinals to a World Series championship, and become in the process one of the most recognizable personalities in American sports. By the late 1940s, his playing career was over, but his voice, a loose, unhurried Arkansas drawl that made every sentence sound like the opening of a good story, was very much in demand. Dizzy Dean became the television and radio voice of Falstaff Beer beginning in 1950, calling St. Louis Cardinals games on the Falstaff Broadcasting Network and punctuating his commentary with endorsements delivered with the casual authority of a man who genuinely preferred what he was selling. He almost certainly did prefer it. That was the point. Dizzy Dean did not read from a script in the way a hired announcer reads from a script. He talked about Falstaff the way he talked about a double play or a curveball, with specific, enthusiastic, slightly rambling affection. When he said, between innings, that there was nothing better after 9 innings in the St. Louis heat than a cold Falstaff, the men listening in their living rooms and in their taverns believed him. Not because they were naive, but because Dean was not a man who could convincingly pretend to like something he did not. His credibility as a baseball figure transferred directly to the product. For nearly a decade, Dizzy Dean and Falstaff Beer were, in the minds of millions of Midwestern and Southern sports fans, essentially the same thing. The advertising campaign that surrounded Dean's broadcasts, built around the slogan, Falstaff, America's Premium Quality Beer, ran consistently through the 1950s, managed in part through the Leo Burnett Agency in Chicago. The television spots were simple by later standards: a pitcher of beer, a glass, a condensation-beaded can on a wooden bar surface. No elaborate narrative. No celebrity cameo beyond Dean's voice in the background. The visual language communicated a single idea: that Falstaff was the beer that serious beer drinkers chose, without apology and without explanation. The market responded with precision. By 1950, Falstaff was shipping more than 3 million barrels annually. By 1955, that figure had climbed past 5 million. The brand held dominant market position in Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa, Louisiana, Texas, and New Mexico. 6 states where the Falstaff name on a tap handle was not a marketing achievement, but a geographic fact, as natural and unremarkable as the Mississippi running south. In the working-class wards of St. Louis, in the longshoremen's bars of New Orleans, in the Cattletown taverns of West Texas, ordering a Falstaff was not a consumer decision. It was a declaration of place. That identity, rooted in geography, in labor, in the specific texture of mid-century American working life, was the most valuable thing Falstaff possessed. It was also the thing most difficult to protect once the company decided to grow beyond it. Papa Joe Griesedek died in 1955. He had built, in 22 years, one of the 5 largest brewing operations in the United States. He had taken a dormant trademark, a mortgaged building on Shenandoah Avenue, and a workforce that had spent 13 years making soft drinks instead of beer, and turned them into a national institution. He did not live to see the peak. He died while the company was still climbing, still opening new territories, still adding production capacity to meet demand that showed no sign of leveling off. The obituaries were respectful. The industry tributes were genuine. And within the company, the transition of leadership to his son Alvin Griesedek was conducted with the quiet efficiency of a family that had always handled its business without drama. Alvin was not Papa Joe. That is not a criticism. It is simply a fact, and facts are what matter here. Papa Joe had built the company through relationships, through geographic discipline, through an instinctive understanding that a regional brewery's greatest asset was the specific trust of a specific community of drinkers. Alvin inherited a company at the beginning of a decade that was rewriting the rules of American business entirely. The 1950s and early 1960s were the age of the conglomerate. The age of national scale, the age of the management consultant and the market share report. The lesson that American corporations drew from the post-war boom was consistent and almost universal. Bigger was better, and growth was the only reliable defense against obsolescence. Alvin Griesediek absorbed that lesson. He believed it. And in the context of 1956 and 1957 and 1958, with Falstaff sales still rising and the company's regional dominance still intact, it was not an unreasonable thing to believe. The expansion continued. A new brewery opened in San Jose, California in 1954, reaching the West Coast market for the first time. A facility in El Paso, Texas, came online in 1956, deepening the southwestern distribution network. In New Orleans, Falstaff opened a major production facility on Clio Street that would become, for a time, one of the largest single-site brewing operations in the South, employing more than 600 workers at its peak, and producing beer that moved through every major bar and restaurant in the city with a reliability that seemed permanent. By 1960, Falstaff was operating 12 breweries across 9 states. By 1964, the number had grown to 14. The company's geographic footprint now extended from coast to coast, a fact that Alvin Griesediek regarded as validation of the expansion strategy and that Papa Joe, had he lived to see it, might have regarded with more complicated feelings. In 1965, Falstaff reached the number that defined its era: 7.5 million barrels of beer shipped in a single calendar year. Third place in the American beer market behind Budweiser and Schlitz, ahead of every other competitor in the country. 1 in 14 beers sold in the United States carried the Falstaff name. The company employed more than 6,000 people across 16 production facilities. Its annual revenue exceeded $200 million. The Falstaff Broadcasting Network, the radio and television infrastructure built around Dizzy Dean's baseball broadcasts, had expanded to carry games for the Houston Colt 45s, the Oakland Athletics, and several minor league affiliates across the Midwest and South. In boardrooms and in industry publications, Falstaff was cited as proof that a regional brewery could successfully become a national one. The model appeared to be working. The numbers were unambiguous. The trajectory pointed in one direction. What the numbers did not show, what numbers rarely show until it is too late, was what was happening inside the product itself. 16 breweries in 16 locations meant 16 separate production environments, 16 sets of local water chemistry, 16 slightly different interpretations of a recipe that had been developed in a single facility on Shenandoah Avenue in 1933. The quality control systems of the mid-1960s were not equal to the task of maintaining absolute consistency across that kind of geographic distribution. Ingredients varied by region. Equipment aged at different rates in different climates. Brewmasters brought their own training and their own instincts to the recipe, and those instincts were not always identical to Papa Joe's original specification. The beer was still good. In most markets, in most facilities, Falstaff in 1965 was still a product that a serious drinker could be proud to order. But it was no longer precisely the same beer in New Orleans as it was in St. Louis, and it was no longer precisely the same beer in San Jose as it was in Omaha. The variation was subtle. Most drinkers could not have articulated it, but some of them felt it. The faint, nagging sense that something had shifted, that the beer they were drinking was not quite the beer they remembered. That feeling, unspoken and largely unmeasured, was the first crack in the foundation. In 1965, while the sales reports were still printing records, the crack was already there. The warning arrived quietly, the way warnings almost always do. In 1966, Anheuser-Busch increased its national advertising budget by 40% in a single fiscal year. The figure was not a secret. It appeared in industry trade publications within months of the decision. What it meant, translated into plain language, was this: Budweiser had decided that the American beer market was not going to remain fragmented much longer, and that the company with the largest marketing infrastructure would determine which brands survived the consolidation and which ones did not. Anheuser-Busch was not competing for market share. It was competing for the entire market. Miller Brewing Company, acquired by Philip Morris in 1969, was moving in the same direction with the specific advantage of a tobacco conglomerate's capital reserves behind it. Philip Morris understood mass-market consumer behavior with a precision that most brewing companies could not match, and it was prepared to spend accordingly. Miller High Life, repositioned, reformulated, and backed by one of the most aggressive advertising campaigns in beverage history, was about to become something it had never previously been: a serious national competitor. Falstaff's management looked at these developments and drew a conclusion that was logical, coherent, and catastrophically wrong. The conclusion was this: the only way to compete with Budweiser and Miller at national scale was to become larger. More breweries, more markets, more volume. The path to survival, in Alvin Griesediek's reading of the situation, ran directly through acquisition. If Falstaff could not outspend its competitors in advertising, it could outgrow them in distribution, owning more tap lines, more shelf positions, more delivery routes than any single competitor could efficiently challenge. The acquisition strategy began in earnest in the late 1960s and accelerated through the early 1970s with a momentum that, in retrospect, resembles less a business plan than a controlled fall. In 1965, Falstaff acquired the Narragansett Brewing Company of Cranston, Rhode Island, at the time the largest selling beer in New England, with a loyal regional following and a production facility that had been operating since 1890. The purchase price was approximately $17 million. On paper, it looked like a bargain: an established brand, an existing distribution network, a customer base that had been drinking Narragansett for generations. What Alvin's team did not fully account for was the cost of what came with it: aging equipment, deferred maintenance, a workforce accustomed to operating under a very different management culture, and a regional identity so specific that it could not be transferred to a St. Louis ownership structure without losing the thing that made it valuable. Narragansett drinkers in Providence and Boston were not drinking it because it was good beer in the abstract. They were drinking it because it was theirs. The moment it became a Falstaff subsidiary, something invisible but real began to drain out of it. Falstaff did not stop at Narragansett. In 1972, the company acquired the Ballantine Brewing Company of Newark, New Jersey, once one of the most storied names in American brewing. A brand with roots going back to 1840 and a loyal following across the mid-Atlantic states. By the time Falstaff purchased it, Ballantine was already in serious decline, its market share eroded by years of management instability and distribution problems. The acquisition price reflected that decline. What it did not reflect was the cost of attempting to resurrect a brand that had already lost the confidence of its core drinkers, in a market, the Northeast, where Falstaff had no existing infrastructure, no relationships, and no history. The pattern was consistent across every acquisition. Falstaff was not buying strength, it was buying distress, at prices that seemed reasonable until the operational costs of rescue were added to the ledger. Each new brewery required capital investment to bring equipment up to standard. Each new market required sales staff, distributor relationships, and advertising expenditure to establish a presence. Each acquisition added debt to a balance sheet that had been clean and conservative under Papa Joe and was now carrying obligations that grew faster than revenue could service them. By 1973, Falstaff was operating breweries in 17 locations across the country. The number was impressive. The economics behind it were not. And then the quality problem, the one that had been quietly developing since the mid-1960s, became impossible to ignore. Drinkers in St. Louis began to notice that the Falstaff coming out of the Missouri facility tasted different from the Falstaff being distributed from the newly acquired plants in the Northeast. Bartenders in New Orleans reported that kegs from the Clio Street facility were inconsistent from one delivery to the next. In Texas, grocery buyers who had stocked Falstaff without a second thought for 20 years began asking distributor representatives questions they had never asked before. Questions about where the beer was brewed, how recently, under what conditions. These were not the questions of disloyal customers. They were the questions of loyal customers who had noticed something wrong and were trying to understand it before they made a decision they did not want to make. In Pittsburgh, by one account, bartenders were pulling untouched pitchers off tables at the end of the evening. Customers were leaving without finishing. That had not happened before. It was not supposed to be possible. Falstaff was the beer people finished. The letters began arriving at the St. Louis headquarters in 1971 and 1972, handwritten, from men who had been drinking Falstaff since before the war, asking what had changed. The company's response was measured and professional and entirely inadequate. Form letters went out, assurances were offered. The word quality appeared in every reply, deployed as a promise rather than a description. The drinkers were not reassured. They were practical people. They responded the way practical people respond to a product that has stopped delivering what it promised. They stopped buying it. The sales numbers told the story with the cold precision that internal memos could not. Falstaff had shipped 7.5 million barrels in 1965. By 1970, that figure had fallen to 6.2 million. By 1973, it was under 5 million. Each year's report arrived with a new explanation: competitive pressure, rising ingredient costs, shifts in regional demographics, the impact of the Arab oil embargo on distribution expenses. The explanations were not false. They were simply insufficient. They described the weather without acknowledging that the roof was gone. Alvin Griesediek's response to the declining numbers followed a pattern familiar to anyone who has watched a large organization confront a reality it does not wish to accept. First came the rebranding. In 1973, Falstaff introduced new packaging, a modernized can design intended to appeal to a younger demographic that the company's research suggested was drifting toward Miller and the newly aggressive Budweiser campaigns. The redesign cost money the company could not easily spare. It moved no meaningful volume. The core Falstaff drinker, the man in his 40s or 50s who had been loyal for 2 decades, looked at the new can and felt dimly that something was being taken from him. The new drinker the campaign was designed to attract looked at it and saw a brand his father drank. Then came the price cuts. Falstaff reduced wholesale prices in several key markets in 1974 and 1975, attempting to hold shelf space against competitors who were outspending them on advertising. Price cuts in a commodity market are a reliable signal of desperation, and distributors read that signal clearly. Several large regional distributors in Texas and the Midwest quietly began shifting their primary commitments toward Budweiser and Miller, not because they disliked Falstaff, but because they were business people, and business people follow momentum. The advertising budget, which should have been protected above all else, was cut instead. The Falstaff Broadcasting Network, the radio and television infrastructure that Dizzy Dean had built into a regional institution, was dismantled progressively through the early 1970s as the company sought to reduce fixed costs. The sports sponsorships that had connected the brand to baseball fans across the Midwest and South were allowed to lapse. The voice of Falstaff went quiet at the exact moment the brand needed to be heard most clearly. What replaced it was silence. And in consumer markets, silence is not neutral. Silence sounds like retreat. The cascade that followed moved with the impersonal efficiency of compound interest working in reverse. Fewer advertising impressions meant fewer new drinkers being introduced to the brand. Fewer new drinkers meant declining volume. Declining volume meant less revenue to fund distribution. Less distribution meant fewer tap handles in bars and fewer facings on grocery store shelves. Fewer facings meant even less volume. The loop closed on itself, tightening with each revolution. The acquisitions that had been intended to expand Falstaff's reach were now anchors. The Narragansett facility in Rhode Island was losing money. The Ballantine operation in New Jersey had never recovered its footing. The smaller plants acquired throughout the expansion years were operating below capacity, carrying fixed costs against revenue that was shrinking faster than management could cut expenses. The debt load became critical in 1975. Falstaff's bankers, who had extended credit through the acquisition years on the assumption that volume would grow to service the obligations, were now looking at a company whose volume was declining in every major market simultaneously. The terms of credit tightened. The options narrowed. Plant closures began. The New Orleans brewery on Clio Street, the facility that had once employed more than 600 workers and supplied beer to every significant account in Louisiana, closed in 1975. 623 workers received their final paychecks over a period of 3 weeks. The equipment was inventoried and sold. The building stood empty. The Fort Wayne, Indiana facility closed in 1976, 240 workers. The Galveston, Texas plant ceased operations the same year. The refrigerated delivery routes that had connected it to accounts across the Gulf Coast were absorbed by competitors within months. In 1977, Falstaff sold the St. Louis Brewery, the original facility on Shenandoah Avenue where Papa Joe had brewed the first batch of Falstaff beer in 1933. The building that had started everything, the limestone-floored production floor where the recipe had been developed and refined across 4 decades, was sold to a real estate holding company for a figure that industry observers described as significantly below market value. The transaction closed on a Friday. There was no ceremony. The end came in 1978. Falstaff Beer filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection on February 18th of that year. Total liabilities exceeded assets by a margin that made reorganization effectively impossible. The brand name and remaining intellectual property were placed in receivership. The Omaha Brewery continued limited production through the bankruptcy proceedings. Then it stopped. The last Falstaff keg was tapped. The last delivery truck made its final route. The phones at the St. Louis offices rang for a while, then did not. The sign came down. No announcement, no farewell, no final edition of the company newsletter with a message from management about what a remarkable journey it had been. Just the ordinary silence of a building that used to make something and no longer did. The Falstaff name did not disappear entirely. Names rarely do in American commerce. What disappears is everything the name once meant. In the years following the 1978 bankruptcy, the Falstaff trademark passed through several ownership changes with the unremarkable efficiency of an asset being processed rather than preserved. S&P Company acquired the brand in the early 1980s and attempted limited production in a small number of markets, contracting with existing breweries to produce beer under the Falstaff label. The beer that came out of those arrangements bore the name and the red and white design. It did not bear much else of what Papa Joe had built. The recipe that had been developed on Shenandoah Avenue in 1933, refined through 2 decades of careful production and distributed across 16 states at its peak, that recipe existed now only in documents and in the memory of brewmasters who were no longer employed by anyone called Falstaff. Pabst Brewing Company acquired the Falstaff brand in 1999, adding it to a portfolio of dormant or semi-dormant American beer labels that included Ballantine, the same Ballantine that Falstaff had purchased in 1972, now held by the company that had outlasted them both. Under Pabst's ownership, Falstaff Beer is produced today by contract brewing arrangements, available in limited markets primarily in the Midwest and South. It is inexpensive. It is consistent. It is not, by any reasonable measure, the same product that a union worker in St. Louis ordered on a Friday evening in 1962. The men and women who remember that product have largely stopped debating whether the current version is faithful to the original. They know it is not. They buy it occasionally when they find it, the way a person might visit a neighborhood that has been entirely rebuilt, not because it resembles what they remember, but because the address is the same. The collectors tell a different story. Among the community of breweriana enthusiasts, collectors of vintage beer cans, tap handles, serving trays, neon signs, and point-of-sale materials from mid-century American breweries, Falstaff occupies a position of consistent and serious demand. A flat-top Falstaff steel can in good condition from the early 1950s sells for between $45 and $120, depending on the specific variant and its provenance. An original Falstaff neon bar sign in working condition, the kind that hung above the tap handles in taverns across Missouri and Louisiana through the 1950s and 1960s, sells for between $350 and $800 on the secondary market and moves quickly when it appears. Falstaff-branded serving trays from the Dizzy Dean broadcasting era, featuring the baseball imagery that connected the brand to Cardinals fandom across a generation of Midwestern sports viewers, have sold at specialized auction houses for prices that would have seemed implausible to the men who ordered them from the printing supplier in 1952. These objects are not valuable because they are rare. They are valuable because they are specific. They carry the physical evidence of a particular moment in American commercial and social life that cannot be reconstructed. A moment when a beer brand was also a geographic identity, a class identity, a Tuesday evening ritual for men who worked with their hands and did not overthink their choices. That specificity is exactly what the current Falstaff cannot provide, regardless of recipe or price point. A drinker who grew up in South St. Louis in the 1960s is not looking for a beer that tastes like Falstaff. He is looking for the experience of being 23 years old in a city that no longer exists in the form he remembers it. No brewing company can produce that. The vintage can on the shelf above his refrigerator gets closer than anything in the bottle. The surprise footnote in the Falstaff story belongs not to the brand itself, but to the family that created it. The Griesedek name did not vanish from American brewing when Falstaff collapsed. Joseph Griesedek III, grandson of Papa Joe, went on to become a respected figure in the craft brewing movement that emerged in the 1980s and 1990s, the same movement that, with considerable historical irony, was built on the principles Papa Joe had practiced at Falstaff's founding. Small batches, local identity, quality over volume, the belief that a beer should taste like it was made by someone who cared. The great-grandson of a German immigrant brewer was helping to rebuild, in microbreweries across Missouri, the philosophy that the conglomerate era had systematically dismantled. Papa Joe would have recognized it immediately. The original Falstaff Brewery at 1920 Shenandoah Avenue in St. Louis was demolished in stages through the 1990s. The site today is a mixed-use development, a combination of residential units and light commercial space, the kind of urban renewal project that fills the footprints of departed industries with the ordinary requirements of contemporary life. There is a historical marker nearby. It is small. Most people walk past it without stopping. What Falstaff represents, viewed from the distance of nearly 5 decades, is not primarily a cautionary tale about overexpansion, though it is certainly that. It is something more precise and more instructive. It is the story of what happens when a company mistakes the map for the territory, when the growth chart becomes more real than the product, when the acquisition target becomes more important than the drinker already holding a glass. Papa Joe Griesediek had understood, with the practical clarity of a man who had learned his trade from the floor of a brewery rather than from a business school, that Falstaff's value was not in its scale, it was in its specificity. The beer that belonged to a place, to a community, to a set of Friday evenings that a particular kind of American worker recognized as his own. That understanding did not transfer with the title deed. It rarely does. And so what remains of Falstaff Beer is this: a name on a can produced somewhere other than St. Louis, a community of collectors who understand what the original was worth, a historical marker on a demolished block in a city that is still, quietly, trying to remember what it used to be. And somewhere in Missouri, on a Saturday afternoon, an older man opens a cooler at a gas station in a town that used to have a Falstaff sign above the bar across the street. He picks up a can. He looks at it for a moment longer than necessary. He puts it back. He is looking for something the label no longer contains. If this is the kind of American brand history that stays with you, give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. We cover the companies, the products, and the founders that built the culture we grew up in, and the forces that took them apart. See you in the next one.